In the early years of the 13th century, northern China stood on the edge of a storm it did not yet fully recognize. For generations, the settled empires of East Asia had viewed the steppe as a recurring problem. Dangerous, certainly, but manageable. Nomadic confederations rose, raided, and fractured. Dynasties endured. The Jin Dynasty, powerful and sophisticated, governed vast agricultural lands, commanded fortified cities, and relied on a bureaucratic machine refined over decades. From their perspective, the frontier was a chessboard. Steppe tribes could be divided, manipulated, or subdued. That assumption had worked before. But something fundamental had changed. In 1206, a leader named Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, uniting the Mongol tribes under a single authority. This was not merely another coalition stitched together by convenience. He dismantled old loyalties and rebuilt them into a disciplined, merit-based military structure. Command flowed through organized units, not family lines. Mobility became doctrine. Intelligence became strategy. What emerged on the steppe was not a raiding party. It was a system designed for sustained war. The Jin court underestimated this transformation. To them, the Mongols were another northern confederation, ambitious but temporary. They failed to see that Genghis Khan was not seeking tribute within an existing hierarchy. He was rejecting that hierarchy altogether. In a world where honor defined sovereignty, demands for submission were more than diplomatic gestures. They were existential challenges. By 1211, confrontation was no longer avoidable. What began as frontier tension would soon become a relentless campaign, and a turning point that would alter the balance of power across East Asia. To understand why the coming war would prove so transformative, we have to look carefully at the two systems preparing to collide. On one side stood the Jin Dynasty, a powerful state founded by the Jurchen in the 12th century, ruling over millions across northern China. This was no fragile frontier regime. It governed fertile farmland, controlled major trade corridors, and commanded cities protected by formidable walls. Its court operated through a layered bureaucracy modeled in part on earlier Chinese dynasties, ministries, tax systems, civil administration, and regional officials bound together by a written culture and institutional continuity. Stability, at least on the surface, appeared deeply rooted. The structure of the Jin political system reflected the confidence of an established empire. Authority flowed from the emperor through a hierarchy of civil and military officials. Records were kept. Taxes were assessed. Grain was stored. Infrastructure, roads, canals, fortified passes, linked the countryside to urban centers. This was a system built for endurance. It assumed that threats could be absorbed, redirected, or worn down over time. In many respects, that assumption had proven correct for decades. Militarily, the Jin dynasty relied on scale and defensive depth. Its armies were large and diverse, composed of Jurchen cavalry, Han Chinese infantry, and auxiliary forces drawn from various subject peoples. Fortified cities formed a defensive network across the northern plains. Garrisons were stationed at strategic passes, and supply depots sustained prolonged campaigns. When confronted with traditional steppe raids, the Jin response emphasized containment, hold the walls, protect the farmland, wait for the nomads to withdraw. This doctrine favored mass, logistics, and positional warfare. It worked well against enemies who eventually had to return to the grasslands. But the Mongols emerging under Genghis Khan were not operating according to the old script. In 1206, when Temujin took the title Genghis Khan, he did more than unify tribes. He re-engineered how loyalty and command functioned on the steppe. The traditional tribal confederation, fluid, personality-driven, and often unstable, was replaced with a decimal military structure. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 created a scalable chain of command. Leaders were appointed for competence and loyalty, not simply noble birth. This was a radical departure from the politics of kinship that had long defined nomadic life. The Mongol military reforms introduced something the Jin court underestimated: institutional cohesion. Warriors were no longer tied primarily to clan leaders but to an integrated command system that answered directly to Genghis Khan. Discipline was strict. Orders were clear. Intelligence networks relayed information rapidly across distances that would have strained most medieval states. Mobility was not improvisational, it was structured. Each cavalryman maintained multiple horses, allowing sustained movement that few sedentary armies could match. Where the Jin system emphasized infrastructure and defensive resilience, the Mongol system emphasized flexibility and coordinated offense. One was built for managing territory, the other was built for expanding it. One relied on fortified cities as anchors, the other thrived in open terrain and adapted quickly when confronted with walls. The contrast ran deeper than tactics. The Jin Dynasty operated through bureaucratic continuity. Decision-making, especially at the highest levels, often moved through formal channels. Court politics could delay response. Regional commanders required authorization. Resources had to be mobilized through administrative layers. This structure provided stability in peacetime but could create friction under rapid, multi-front pressure. The Mongol command model was leaner. Authority was concentrated, and communication within the army was direct. Genghis Khan's leadership style combined consultation with decisive final authority. He expected initiative from subordinates but demanded results. The chain of command, streamlined by design, enabled swift shifts in strategy. When faced with unexpected resistance, Mongol forces adapted in real time rather than waiting for bureaucratic recalibration. From the perspective of system design, this was a confrontation between scale and speed. The Jin Dynasty possessed greater population, deeper agricultural resources, and more sophisticated urban infrastructure. The Mongols possessed unity of purpose, operational mobility, and a leadership structure optimized for rapid execution. For years, the Jin court had manipulated steppe politics to prevent exactly this kind of consolidation. They had supported rival tribes, distributed titles, and maintained a delicate balance beyond the Great Wall. That strategy assumed fragmentation as the natural state of the steppe. But Genghis Khan's reforms altered that equilibrium. The frontier was no longer a mosaic of competing clans. It was a centralized power with strategic ambition. What made this moment so consequential was not simply the strength of either side but the mismatch in expectations. The Jin Dynasty saw a familiar type of adversary and prepared accordingly. Genghis Khan saw a systemic obstacle to long-term security and planned to dismantle it methodically. When these two structures moved toward war in 1211, it was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision between institutional philosophies. One trusted walls and hierarchy. The other trusted mobility and merit. One relied on inherited stability. The other thrived on engineered change. History often turns when established systems fail to recognize that their opponent has rewritten the rules. In northern China at the dawn of the 13th century, that miscalculation would prove decisive. Wars of consequence rarely begin with a single insult or a sudden burst of anger. They grow out of structure, ambition, and calculation. The conflict between Genghis Khan and the Jin Dynasty was no exception. By the time Mongol forces crossed the frontier in 1211, the decision for war had already matured through years of strategic thought. This was not a raid fueled by pride. It was a deliberate move in a long-term plan. For decades, the Jin Dynasty had claimed overlordship over the steppe. Titles had been granted to tribal leaders. Tribute had flowed south. Diplomatic rituals reinforced hierarchy. In theory, the Mongols existed within a political order shaped by Jin authority. But when Temujin unified the tribes and became Genghis Khan in 1206, that hierarchy became intolerable. Sovereignty on the steppe was inseparable from honor. To accept symbolic subordination would undermine the very unity he had fought to create. Breaking Jin overlordship was not merely a matter of pride. It was a structural necessity. A unified Mongol state could not exist under another power's shadow. There was also the matter of security. Genghis Khan understood that consolidation without stabilization invites collapse. The Jin court had long practiced divide and manage politics beyond the Great Wall, supporting rival factions to prevent any one power from dominating the steppe. That strategy had helped create the fractured environment from which he emerged. Leaving the Jin dynasty intact meant leaving open the possibility that it could once again interfere in Mongol internal affairs. Securing the northern frontier required more than defensive readiness. It required neutralizing the largest external influence capable of destabilizing the steppe. But strategy extended beyond defense. The Jin dynasty represented immense economic opportunity. Northern China was home to dense agricultural production, established trade routes, and skilled artisans. Campaigns required resources. Horses and warriors alone could not sustain prolonged operations without access to grain, metalwork, and siege expertise. By targeting Jin territory, Genghis Khan aimed to acquire not just plunder but capacity. Conquest would provide revenue streams, engineers, and administrative talent. War, in this sense, became an investment in future campaigns. The psychological dimension was equally important. Unity among the Mongols had been achieved through shared victory. Success reinforced loyalty, failure invited fragmentation. A decisive campaign against a major dynasty would send a message not only to neighboring states but to the Mongol ranks themselves. It would confirm that their new system worked. Momentum matters in any enterprise, whether political or commercial. Early wins create credibility. For Genghis Khan, defeating the Jin would validate his reforms and cement confidence in centralized command. This is where the long-term vision becomes clear. The campaign of 1211 to 1215 was not an endpoint. It was a foundation. Before projecting power westward into Central Asia or deeper into China, Genghis Khan needed strategic depth and economic strength. The Jin dynasty sat directly in the path of expansion. Leaving it untouched would constrain future movement and expose Mongol territory to counterattack. Removing it, step by step, would open corridors into the heart of East Asia. Seen from this perspective, war functioned as strategic consolidation. It aligned political sovereignty, territorial security, economic acquisition, and psychological reinforcement into a single objective. The Mongol leader was not reacting impulsively. He was shaping an environment in which future expansion could proceed with reduced risk. For audiences accustomed to thinking in terms of business strategy or long-range planning, the logic is recognizable. Before scaling, you stabilize. Before entering new markets, you secure your base. Genghis Khan applied similar principles on a geopolitical scale. The Jin dynasty was both competitor and constraint. Eliminating that constraint would free the Mongol state to operate without constant northern tension. It is also worth noting what this decision reveals about leadership under uncertainty. War against the Jin was risky. The dynasty commanded larger populations, fortified cities, and established infrastructure. A failed campaign could fracture the fragile unity of the Mongols. Yet inaction carried its own danger. Allowing a powerful neighbor to remain unchecked would preserve vulnerability. Strategic leadership often involves choosing between imperfect options. Genghis Khan chose calculated offense over cautious stagnation. By 1211, the logic had crystallized. Breaking Jin overlordship would affirm sovereignty. Securing the frontier would protect unity. Economic gains would strengthen capacity. Psychological victory would generate momentum. War became not an eruption of anger but a deliberate mechanism of state building. When Mongol forces began their advance, they did so with clarity of purpose. The campaign that followed would test adaptability, endurance, and discipline. But its origins lay in a strategic framework built years earlier. The fall of the Jin dynasty was not the product of sudden aggression. It was the execution of a plan designed to transform a regional power into an empire poised for continental reach. When Mongol forces crossed into Jin territory in 1211, they did not advance as raiders testing the frontier. They moved with the coordination of an army executing a deliberate campaign. Columns pushed through mountain passes and across open plains with speed that unsettled Jin commanders accustomed to slower, more predictable incursions. What began that year was not a seasonal conflict. It was the opening phase of sustained pressure that would unravel the northern backbone of the dynasty. The first major shock came at the Battle of Yehuling. Jin forces attempted to block the Mongol advance along defensive lines in rugged terrain, believing geography would offset the mobility of steppe cavalry. Instead, Mongol commanders maneuvered with precision, exploiting gaps, attacking flanks, and maintaining relentless pressure. Horse archers struck at range, withdrew before counterattacks formed, and returned in coordinated waves. The Jin army, built around mass formations and defensive cohesion, found itself outpaced and outmaneuvered. The defeat at Yehuling was not merely tactical, it was psychological. For the first time, the Jin faced an enemy that refused to disengage after victory. Mobility was the Mongols' decisive advantage. Each warrior rotated among multiple horses, allowing the army to sustain movement across vast distances without exhaustion. Composite bows delivered armor-piercing force from ranges that disrupted heavier units before they could close. Communication through signal flags and disciplined chains of command allowed simultaneous strikes across a broad front. This was warfare engineered for flexibility. The Jin defensive doctrine, by contrast, relied on fortified positions, supply depots, and large garrisons anchored to cities. That system assumed time was an ally. The Mongols denied them time. As the campaign deepened, the Jin court attempted to stabilize its defensive network. Garrisons were reinforced. Regional armies mobilized. Yet Mongol strategy shifted from direct confrontation to systemic disruption. Rather than battering every fortified city immediately, they severed supply lines, cut canals, and isolated strongholds from one another. Trade routes were disrupted. Grain shipments were intercepted. Communications between regional commanders frayed. The objective was not simply to win battles but to collapse connectivity. Here the Mongols confronted their own limitations. Walled cities posed a formidable challenge. Early assaults met stiff resistance. Siege warfare was not native to steppe tradition. But this is where adaptation reshaped the campaign. Genghis Khan incorporated engineers from conquered territories, Chinese, Khitan, and others skilled in siegecraft. Knowledge became a weapon. Catapults and siege engines appeared alongside cavalry formations. Techniques were refined through experience. Where initial attempts faltered, methods evolved. The campaign became a study in learning under fire. Mongol forces surrounded urban centers, probing for weakness while maintaining pressure in the countryside. Some cities resisted and paid dearly when they fell. Others negotiated surrender, recognizing the pattern unfolding across the north. Each capitulation reinforced Mongol credibility. Each destruction amplified fear. By 1213 and 1214, the structural strain on the Jin Dynasty was unmistakable. Refugees streamed south. Resources were stretched thin as the court attempted to defend multiple threatened zones simultaneously. Political divisions within the Jin leadership compounded the crisis. Debates over strategy delayed decisive response. Defensive strength, once a source of confidence, became strategic rigidity. In 1214, the Jin emperor made a decision that revealed the depth of the pressure. The capital would be relocated from Zhongdu, modern Beijing, to Kaifeng in the south. Officially, the move was framed as strategic repositioning. In reality, it signaled retreat. Abandoning the northern capital fractured morale. It communicated vulnerability to both allies and enemies. The Mongols interpreted the relocation as confirmation that their strategy was working. Zhongdu remained a symbol of Jin authority. Its fall would be more than a tactical victory. It would represent the breaking of the dynasty's northern command center. Mongol forces tightened their encirclement, cutting off relief attempts and maintaining relentless attrition. In 1215, after prolonged siege and mounting deprivation within the walls, Zhongdu fell. The sack that followed was devastating. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction and immense loss of life. For the Mongols, the fall of Zhongdu demonstrated that even one of East Asia's great fortified capitals could not withstand sustained, adaptive pressure. For the Jin dynasty, it marked the collapse of its northern stronghold and the erosion of its aura of invincibility. Yet the campaign did not end in a single dramatic moment. The Jin state survived in the south, continuing resistance for years. But between 1211 and 1215, its structural integrity had been shattered. Revenue streams were disrupted. Defensive lines were broken. Political cohesion weakened. The war had exposed the limits of a system designed for containment when confronted by an opponent engineered for momentum. The core narrative of these years reveals more than battlefield victories. It shows a pattern: speed against scale, adaptation against rigidity, sustained pressure against defensive depth. The Mongols learned, adjusted, and intensified. The Jin responded, fortified, and retreated. By the time Zhongdu fell, the outcome was no longer surprising. It was the logical result of a campaign that refused to stall. What began in 1211 as an invasion had, by 1215, transformed the balance of power in northern China. The Mongol war machine had proven it could dismantle not only armies but systems. And once that precedent was established, the implications extended far beyond a single dynasty. When we step back from the smoke of burned cities and the thunder of hooves, the broader implications of the campaign between 1211 and 1215 come sharply into focus. This was not simply a frontier war. It was a structural event, one that reshaped the balance of power in East Asia and altered the trajectory of imperial history. The conflict between Mongol Empire and the Jin Dynasty became a turning point precisely because it exposed which system could endure sustained pressure and which could not. The first and most immediate consequence was the shattering of the northern backbone of Jin authority. Northern China had long served as the dynasty's economic engine and defensive shield. Its fortified cities, agricultural production, and tax base supported the imperial court and its armies. When Mongol forces severed supply lines, isolated urban centers, and ultimately captured Zhongdu, they did more than win territory. They dismantled the infrastructure that made centralized governance possible. Revenue streams faltered. Command networks frayed. The state survived, but its spine had been broken. For observers across East Asia, the psychological shock was profound. The Jin had been regarded as a major power, militarily formidable, administratively sophisticated, and territorially expansive. If such a dynasty could be humbled by what many had dismissed as nomadic horsemen, then no established regime could consider itself immune. Courts in neighboring states recalculated. Diplomacy shifted. Tribute systems were reassessed. Fear travels faster than armies, and in this case, fear magnified Mongol influence far beyond the territory they physically controlled. The fall of northern Jin strongholds also opened corridors deeper into China. Geography that once functioned as a buffer became a pathway. Mountain passes and frontier zones that had shielded the agrarian heartland were now staging grounds for further operations. The campaign created operational depth for the Mongols. It provided access to resources, engineers, and administrative knowledge that would later prove decisive in campaigns against the southern Song and beyond. What began as a war of liberation from former overlordship evolved into the foundation for continental expansion. At a structural level, the conflict highlights a striking contrast between institutional flexibility and structural rigidity. The Jin state possessed hierarchy, bureaucracy, and established military doctrine. These qualities are strengths in stable conditions. But when confronted with a rapidly adapting opponent, they became liabilities. Decision-making slowed. Defensive strategies remained tethered to assumptions about static warfare and predictable threats. The Mongols, by contrast, operated within a command system that rewarded initiative within discipline. They absorbed siege technology from conquered peoples, integrated engineers into their ranks, and adjusted tactics based on battlefield realities. Adaptation was not an exception, it was embedded in their culture of command. For a modern audience, particularly entrepreneurs, executives, and creators accustomed to volatile markets, this contrast feels familiar. Systems built for efficiency in stable environments often struggle when disruption accelerates. Organizations that adapt quickly, integrate new capabilities, and decentralize execution tend to outperform those that cling to legacy structures. In the early 13th century, this principle played out not in boardrooms, but across plains and city walls. Momentum emerged as the Mongols' greatest strategic asset. Each victory reinforced the next. Success generated recruits, resources, and intelligence. Cities that might have resisted chose negotiation after witnessing the fate of those who did not. Opponents faced not just an army, but but an expanding narrative of inevitability. Momentum reduces friction. It shortens decision cycles. It weakens opposition before contact is made. The Jin court, relocating south to Kaifeng, hoped to preserve continuity. And in a narrow sense, it did. The dynasty did not collapse immediately, yet momentum had shifted irreversibly. The initiative belonged to Genghis Khan. Strategic options for the Jin narrowed year by year, while Mongol options expanded. That asymmetry, expanding choice versus contracting choice, is often the clearest indicator of long-term outcome. Beyond regional politics, the campaign signaled the emergence of a new imperial paradigm. The Mongols demonstrated that a polity rooted in steppe traditions could master sedentary warfare, integrate foreign expertise, and project power across vast distances. The stereotype of nomadic limitation dissolved. In its place stood a model of hybrid empire, mobile yet administratively capable, decentralized yet strategically unified. The implications extended into global history. The weakening of the Jin state created space for further Mongol expansion into Central Asia, the Islamic world, and eventually Eastern Europe. Networks of trade and communication would later flourish under Mongol rule, reshaping economic patterns across Eurasia. The campaign of 1211 to 1215 was not the empire's largest conquest, but it was one of its most formative. It proved scalability. It validated the system. In the end, the significance of this campaign lies not only in territory gained or cities lost. It lies in the demonstration that power is as much about adaptability and psychological leverage as it is about numbers and walls. The Jin Dynasty represented established authority. The Mongols embodied emergent force. When those two systems collided, the one capable of learning faster prevailed. History often turns not on a single battle, but on the moment when momentum becomes irreversible. Between 1211 and 1215, that moment arrived in northern China, and the ripple effects would shape the century to come. What unfolded between 1211 and 1215 was more than a sequence of invasions. It was a decisive turning point in the history of East Asia. The blows delivered by the Mongol Empire against the Jin Dynasty did not simply redraw borders. They reordered assumptions about power itself. A dynasty once considered immovable was forced into retreat, while a rising force from the steppe proved that adaptability could overcome entrenched authority. Yet this was not destruction for its own sake. It was transformation. The campaign revealed that leadership under uncertainty requires more than courage. It demands clarity of vision and the willingness to evolve faster than one's rivals. Genghis Khan understood momentum as a strategic asset. He understood that structural change often begins at the margins, in places established powers overlook. And once that momentum gathers, it reshapes entire regions. For us today, whether we lead companies, build new ventures, or navigate complex markets, the lesson endures. The greatest shifts rarely announce themselves as world-changing. They begin quietly, at the edges, and accelerate through disciplined execution and strategic vision. History reminds us that the future belongs not to the most comfortable system, but to the one most prepared to adapt.